In this video, we're looking at two methods that we can use to import all the files in a folder into Power Query so that we end up with a single table. So we can put lots of data files together into a folder and Power Query just combines them together. It's like magic. And if we add new data files to that folder, they get included in that query too. Now, there's one thing to be aware of, that if we use this method, there does need to be some level of consistency between those files. Power Query is magic, but it can't achieve the impossible. Now, in this video, we are going to look at CSV and Excel files and two methods to deal with them. They're probably the most common file types that we encounter as Excel users. So if you're ready, let's get started. If you want to work along with this video, then you can download the example files and you can find links for that in the descriptions box below. In the downloads folder, you'll find 8 files, 4 CSV and 4 Excel files for January, February, March and April 2019. Initially, we're going to start by just looking at the CSV files. CSV files are easier to work with because they only contain one set of data. They only or should only have one header row and they don't allow any merged cells. So to begin with, select the January and the February files and let's move them into the import folder. To see what any of these files look like, you can see that I have the January one open here. We have date, customer, product, sold by and value. And we want to combine all of these together into a single table. So let me close that. And then I want to move those files into my import folder. For this first method, we're going to combine the CSV files together. So in Excel, in a brand new workbook, we can go to Data, Get Data, From File, From Folder. If you then navigate to the folder where those files are saved, mine's called Import Folder, and then click Open. Power Query then gives us a preview list of those files. We want to click on the Transform Data button. Okay, that has now loaded the main Power Query preview window, and we can see the 4 files listed that were in our folder. Initially, we just want to work with the CSV files. So with the extension column selected, I'm going to go to Transform, and then Format, and then make sure that all of those are lowercase. This means that if we want to work with files that have any uppercase or lowercase characters in the extension, that they'll still work correctly. Then I want to filter this column so that it only includes CSV files. So on the text filter, I'll go to equals, and in the filter rows dialog box, I'm going to put equals.csv, and then click OK. Right, that's now filtered down to just include the CSV files. Next, we want to combine all of these files together. For this, I'm going to click the Combine Files button, and this is the button that performs all of the magic to combine these files together. So I'll click that. The Combine Files dialog box has opened up. I'm just going to click OK on that, and then Power Query will create a number of additional queries and steps to help us combine these files together. There we go. On the left we have a whole load of more queries, and on the right we have more steps. Let's just scroll down in our data to see what's happened. And you can see here that at row 50, that's where our February data ends, and at row 51 is where our January data begins. So this has combined both of those CSV files together into a single query. Now, if you're working along with this method, you don't need to change any of these helper queries. So the parameter one, the sample file, and the transform file, you don't need to touch those at all. Actually, you shouldn't touch them at all. But we have our transform sample file. This is a query that we can change, because what happens is that for each file in our folder, any transformations applied to our first file, the sample file, is then applied to every other file in that folder and then combined together in the input folder. Your query might be called something different, Mine is just called import folder because that is the name of the file which all that data was from. So ideally, if there's any transformations to make, we want to make them in the transform sample file first, and then any other queries that can't go in there, we'll put into that main query, so the import folder in this scenario. In the import folder, Power Query also created a number of additional steps. Let's just look through these steps to see what's happening. So we have the source, then we change the text to lowercase, we then filtered to only include .csv files. Power Query then ignored any hidden files. After that, it invoked the transform file function. Now this function is based on whatever changes we make to the transform sample file. So any changes we make to the transform sample file are automatically added to this function, which is then applied to every file in the folder. It then removes all the other columns and drills down into those tables. And then finally, it's applied a changed type step. So that means if we want to get back any of the columns that were previously removed, we can come back to the remove other columns step. I can click on that gear icon. And for example, I could add the name column back in. And then if I were to come to the end, you can see that that name column is in my final query. In this scenario, we don't need that. So let me just remove that column. Right, let's head across into the transform sample file and make some additional transformations. You can see that the applied steps have source and promoted headers. We're happy with those. I'm not particularly happy with the data types. So for a date, now because this is a CSV file, if this CSV file comes from a region that uses a date format that is not the same as yours, then it might give you a strange date if you converted this into a date format. So if you're working in the US, for example, if you were to convert this to a date format, it wouldn't give you valid dates. Instead, because it's a CSV file, we're going to go to using locale. Then in the data type, we'll select date and the locale. So the source file is English United Kingdom. So it's using dates based on English United Kingdom. And you can see some examples there. I'll click OK. The other columns, so the next three should all be text. And then my value column should be a currency, for example. Right, now let's head to our main query. And you can see that this already has data types applied, but our value column is now a whole number rather than a currency. And this is because any data types are not transferred from the transform sample file. It's actually this additional step here of change type that Power Query added when it originally created our helper queries and helper steps. So let's just change these data types. Now, because date was already changed using locale in the transform sample file, that means that it's already in an acceptable date format. So I'm just going to select all of those and detect data type. The only change I'm going to make is to change value into a currency and replace the current step. Perfect. I'm now going to go to home, close and load to, and I'm going to load this query into Excel. So I've got a table on the existing worksheet and then I'll click OK. Perfect. If we scroll down again, you can see that we have around row 51 and 52 is when it switches between the January and February data. Before we add any new data to this folder and click refresh, let's have a look at method number 2. Okay, for method number 2, I've got a new blank workbook open again. I'm going to go to data, get data from file, from folder. I'll select my import folder again and then click open. Again, I'll click on the transform data option. In here, I'm going to select my content and name columns. And then I'm going to remove columns, remove other columns. Next, I'm going to add a custom column. So add column, custom column. And in here, we're going to write an M code function. I'm going to call this column CSV. And the function that we want to use is csv.document. Remember that anything we type in Power Query is case sensitive. I want the content column in there, and I'm just going to click OK. Actually, I've forgotten to filter out my CSV files. So let's go back and add that step. So in the extension column, I want to go to Transform, Format, Lowercase. I'll insert that step, and then we want to filter the text filter so that it only equals .csv files. .csv, OK. Now when I come back to my added custom step, I'm not going to click on the Combine Files option. Instead, I'm going to click on the Expand option. I don't need to use the original name as prefix, and then I'll click OK. Right, if we scroll down, you should be able to see that here we go, row 52, we changed from February data into the January data, so it has combined these two files together. But instead of having multiple helper queries and a main query, we just have this one query called import folder, which means any transformations we make, we're making to the entire dataset. I'll start by selecting the content and name columns, and then I will remove those columns. Then under the transform ribbon, I can use the first row as headers. Down here, where our new file starts, we still have our headers included in that dataset. So therefore we need to remove that. So I've right clicked on that cell, gone to text filters, and I'll select does not equals. So now anything with the word date in that date column has been removed. Right, let's apply our data types. Again, it's a CSV file using a date, so I'm going to go to using locale. It's a date data type, and the file is based on English United Kingdom dates. Click OK. Let's change those columns to text. And finally, my value can change to a currency. Perfect, all looks good. Let's close and load that into Excel. So home, close and load to. I'll select a table inside the existing worksheet on cell A1 and then click OK. Perfect. If we scroll down, once again, we can see that we do have January and February's data both included in this table. Okay, now let's add more data into our folder and see what happens when we refresh. Okay, so I'm going to select my March files and add them both into the import folder. Then in my method 1 query, I'll go to data and click refresh all. If you watch on the import folder, it currently has 100 rows loaded. When I refresh that, it now has 150 rows loaded. And as we scroll down, you can see that that March data has now been included. Let's have a look at book number 2, which was method number 2. Again, our import folder query says 100 rows loaded. When we refresh all, it now has 150 rows loaded, so it includes that March data also. Okay, we're about to add another file into our folder, but there's an issue. We're going to find out what happens if we don't have file uniformity. Because in the file that we're about to add, we've changed the name of a column. And this is to illustrate the problem of what happens if our files aren't all structured in the same way. Okay, so let's head back over to Excel and see what's going to happen. So I'll open up our April 2019 CSV file. And you can see here that in our previous query, we have a column which is called customer. But in our April CSV file, that same column is called sold to. So let me close that CSV file and let's add these files into our folder. So I'll drag those into the import folder. And then with method 1, I'll click refresh all. And you can see there's an error because the column customer of the table wasn't found. Let's do the same with method 2. So again in here, go to data, refresh all, and again that same column wasn't found. So this just illustrates how important it is that when we use these techniques that our files do have a consistent layout. Okay, now let's move on to look at Excel workbooks, because there are a few different challenges that come with Excel workbooks. The method to import and combine Excel workbooks is very similar to the method to import and combine CSV files. However, Excel workbooks are much more complex than a CSV file. For example, a workbook might contain multiple worksheets. It might contain multiple tables. And on any one of those worksheets, that first row might not be the header row. So we're just going to move on now and look at method 1 and method 2 using Excel workbooks as the source. And we'll also see a little quirk of how we can work with Excel worksheets when they have different names. Okay, so let's head on to method number 1. So here I've created a new Excel workbook. I've already connected to our folder. I've already filtered to only include .xlsx workbooks. The other thing I've done is, because we know that there's an error inside our April file, is that I've removed that from our import folder. So we only have 3 XLSX workbooks. So now, as before, we can click the Combine Files option. So here you can see that we have our workbook, and it has a worksheet called February. Now this gives us a problem, because when we select the file called February, that means that Power Query will look for a worksheet called February inside every workbook. But the January workbook has a worksheet called January, and the March workbook has a worksheet called March. So normally for this method to work, we need to make sure that our worksheets all have the same name. However, if our workbook only contains a single worksheet, then there is a method that we can use so that we remove the search for the name. And that's what we're going to look at in a few moments' time. So Power Query has now created all of our helper queries and also added the additional steps into our import folder query. So these are the same as we saw before. Now, if we scroll down, you'll notice that at the end of the February file, we see a line that's called error. If we click on that, we see an error occurred in the transform file. The key didn't match any rows in the table. You can see that it's referencing the item February. And as I said, this is because each of our worksheets has a different name. So let's fix that. We'll come into the transform sample file. We'll look at our source step, and then the navigation step, where the kind is a sheet. So if you go back to the previous step, it's filtered items called January, where the kind is a sheet. So we only want sheets, that's true. So let's remove this section there that says item equals February. You can click away on that, and then let's make the other transformations. So I want to remove rows, remove top rows. I'll insert a step, remove 3 rows, and then we can then promote headers. Then I'll select all the columns and go to transform detect data type. Because our source is an Excel workbook, then it's likely that those dates are valid dates, because Excel handles dates using a serial number basis. So therefore we shouldn't need to use the using locale method. I'm happy with text, text and text for the next 3 columns, and then values should be changed to currency. We'll replace that current step. You'll notice that we now have an error on our import folder. So let's click on that. You can see the column sales data of the table wasn't found. If we look in our formula bar at the top, you can see it's looking for sales data column 1, column 3, column 4, column 5. This is because we removed rows at the top of our query. So let me remove that change type step. I'll select all those columns again, and then we can apply it correctly. I'll replace that current step, and then we can close and load this into Excel. So home, close and load to. We want a table on an existing worksheet in cell A1, and then I'll click OK. Right, you can see there we have 150 rows loaded, which means that we have January, February and March data all loaded together inside this single table. Okay, it's now time to move on and look at method number 2 using the Excel workbook as the source. Okay, here we are back in Power Query. I've connected to the same folder and I've filtered down to just include the XLSX files. I'll select the content and name columns, right click and then remove other columns. We'll then go to add column and create a custom column. I'm going to call this column Excel. The function we want to use is Excel.workbook. Just be careful about the case sensitivity there. The E and the W should both be capital. I'll then open a bracket, double click on the content column, close that bracket and then click OK. We can then expand that table as before. We don't want to use the original column name as prefix, and then I'll click OK. Now, rather than drilling into the data, what we've done is drilled into the workbook. In that workbook, we have this item called data. Each of those is a data object, and in this scenario, it is a worksheet. So if we wanted to, we could filter out specific items here in the item column if we needed a more advanced approach. I'm just going to right click on my data column and go to remove other columns, and then I can expand the data column. I'll click OK on that. And now we have all those files stacked on top of each other, but we do have those header sections included in there. So we just need to undertake a few more transformations. First of all, from the home ribbon, I want to remove rows, remove top rows. And I'll select to remove the top 3 rows. Then from the home ribbon, I can use the first row as headers. So that's given us a header for our column, but we just need to remove these other values that aren't part of our data. So on the null value, I'll right click on that, filters, does not equal, and then the same with the value. I'll select those columns, go to transform, and then detect data type. The only change I want to make to that is to change it to a currency. Place that current step. And then finally, we can go to home, close and load to. A table on the existing worksheet, and I'll click OK. Fantastic, we've now loaded that data into Excel as well. Okay, that brings us to the end of our video where we showed 2 methods of how we can combine Excel and CSV files together from a folder. This is a fantastic method that can save so much time because we can simply drop files into that folder, refresh, and Power Query brings them all through. However, we saw the issues that can happen if our files are not uniform. If those column names are not the same, it can cause us an error. Equally, ideally, we want our Excel worksheets to all have the same name. Then they get picked up inside their M code and can easily be combined. So therefore, again, uniformity is key to success with these methods. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.